What's up, party people, and welcome back to another episode of NYC Foodways, your weekly food and culture discussion from the cultural capital of the world. My name is John, and this week's episode is dedicated to the life and legacy of directorial genius Chris Marker, whose films La Jetée and Sans Soleil left an indelible mark on my conception of what cinema is and could be. One's cultural journey is punctuated by the encountering of fellow travelers whom we meet before we see. This is what happens when we consume the art of another. Some of these folks produce works that so directly speak to our sensibilities, it feels like they must know us personally, and by the time we finish their work, it feels like we know them too. Recently, I had only to get to the second paragraph of the book Creole Italian to sense such a familiarity, and that's the second paragraph of the acknowledgement section that precedes the introduction to the book, mind you. This is where Dr. Justin A. Nystrom, author of Creole Italian and a professor of history at Loyola University in New Orleans, pens the clause, "The idea of using food as a lens onto this world," and that's when I knew it was meant to be. The full title of his book and the subject of this week's episode is Creole Italian, Sicilian Immigrants in the Shaping of New Orleans Food Culture. And if none of these words interest you, I probably don't want to hang out with you IRL. In the first sentence of the introduction section that follows the acknowledgements, Nystrom mentions Mosca's Restaurant and the Muffalata, two of the crown jewels of New Orleans food culture. By the second page of the introduction, the author gives us an overview on how the migration of people and foodstuffs is crucial to understand when looking to understand New Orleans, and a phrase popped into my head: "This guy gets it." He continues shortly thereafter by stating that scholars have increasingly used food as a lens for understanding society, particularly with regard to immigrants' contributions. Let's go. Generally, Creole Italian is a phrase used unironically in and about New Orleans to refer to a narrow subset of that city's food and restaurant scene that features Sicilian American cooking techniques and New Orleans ingredients and style of service. Some of this channel's favorite restaurants in New Orleans, such as Mandina's, Pascal's Manali, and the legendary Mosca's, all fall under the category of Creole Italian. But Nystrom calls his book Creole Italian not in honor of this niche foodway, but rather almost entirely in the spirit of irony, a form of resistance to the unimaginative lexicography that finds New Orleans setting the word Creole as the keystone in an interpretive arch that bridges all that is culturally worthwhile about the city. The desire to see Creole in all things arguably has long robbed the city of the potential for a richer cultural self-image. The thesis of Creole Italian is that the mass marketing of New Orleans culture as that of a Creole city, that is, a largely French one, ignores the foundational and widespread impact of the 40,000 immigrants from Sicily who, according to Nystrom, were actually responsible for much of New Orleans food culture. This is a fascinating thesis, one I'd not encountered before, and Nystrom does a great job backing it up over 180 pages of thoroughly researched scholarship. Creole Italian covers a lot of ground, as most academic texts do, but for the sake of this video, Creole Italian is about how so much of the what and how of eating in today's New Orleans can be traced back to or was heavily influenced by the Sicilians who landed there in the 19th and early 20th centuries. New Orleans is nothing if not a food city, perhaps the food city, and notwithstanding the Brooklynization of parts of the New Orleans dining scene in recent years, creating the same twee bull you can find in annoying hipster neighborhoods across the country, New Orleans public-facing foodways are pretty much cultural isolates. There's nowhere else in the country with the same quantity per capita of po' boy shops, oyster bars, neighborhood drinking places that also serve food, and fine dining restaurants. Nystrom makes the convincing case that we owe the modern incarnations of all of these, really, to the influx of Sicilians to the Crescent City. To give just one example, Commander's Palace, the prototypical Creole fine dining establishment, was founded by a commander whose parents changed their name from Camarda upon immigrating to these fair shores from Sicily. It should be noted here Sadly, but perhaps not surprisingly, that this book was not published by any printing house in New Orleans, or even Louisiana for that matter. Tracking with that state's record of being unable to fully capitalize on its own treasures, Creole Italian was published by the University of Georgia Press in 2018. Anyway, there were two major waves of Sicilian immigrants to New Orleans. The first was a group involved in the transatlantic shipment of produce, mainly lemons, from Sicily to New Orleans, and this group arrived in New Orleans during the middle of the 19th century. These folks were mostly well-off merchants, and their fortunes only grew after they landed on these shores and began to put down roots in the Crescent City. The economic pathways these early traders forged between the big ports of Sicily and those of Louisiana set the stage for the later and much better known migration of poorer Sicilian agriculturalists and laborers around the turn of the 20th century, the oft-caricatured, huddled masses that are usually conceived of when Americans think of our immigrant European forebears. I loved this book. It's well-paced, informative without being burdensome, and is emotionally attached to its subjects but does not come off as maudlin. Most university press published books are well-researched in the value-neutral sense of the word. They also tend to be dry, ponderous, boring, and are often only read by anyone who is not a professor or paid book reviewer if they are assigned reading for a college class. This book, while maybe just this side of too niche for recommendation to the general reading public, is without a doubt recommended to any readers interested in any or all of the following topics, among many, many others: the socioeconomics of food, immigrant foodways in the U.S., that is, American foodways, the links between macaroni and jazz, emigration from the tiny island of Ustica off the coast of Palermo, New Orleans in general and the historical food and cultural pathways therein, and where on Avenue U in Brooklyn in the current year one can find a cow spleen, lard, and ricotta sandwich. About halfway through typing up my notes for Creole Italian, I realized I had already accrued enough text to double the length of a typical NYC Foodways episode, so enamored am I with the contents of this book. Academic treatises often feature a central section of images, charts, graphs, and the like, and Creole Italian is no different. Nystrom includes a good number of photos, including some he took himself, and does us an amazing service in drawing up an easy-to-read map of the Sicilian French Quarter of the first half of the 20th century. I won't be able to fully express the detail of this map due to the constraints of YouTube, but it's amazing to see how many of today's best-known French Quarter businesses were once part of the Sicilian scene back in the day. The French Quarter of today, especially the upper quarter, that is, the side closer to Canal Street and the English part of the city, is a tourist district non-pareil. Outside of Times Square, I don't think I've ever encountered a more touristy place in this country. But it wasn't long ago that the quarter was a residential area for locals, specifically locals of Sicilian extract, one where ships loading and unloading cargo at the now-defunct piers provided food for the region and lifeblood for an entire community. At the heart of this community was the French market, which has operated in one form or another since 1789. Think about that for a moment. Today, much like the rest of the quarter, the French market is largely a tourist trap, but for centuries, yes, centuries, it was an important place for the buying and selling of both wholesale and retail goods. New Orleans today suffers from a dearth of public markets of any kind, surprise, surprise, but one of the great gems of this book is Nystrom's recounting of the role of the public market in daily life in New Orleans. He writes, "The city had a total of 34 markets before 1911, the most of any major metropolitan area." He continues, "For much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, the city forbade private markets from operating within 9 blocks of public markets, all but guaranteeing them a monopoly on fresh food sales and making them neighborhood gathering places." Fucking rip. Nystrom deftly describes the waterfront commerce of the lower French Quarter as the commercial dialogue that had governed life in the city's oldest sector. There is absolutely a dialogue of commerce, and when it is between or across classes or groups from different backgrounds, it's a lovely dialogue to behold. If you don't believe me, go soak in the energy at your local farmer's market. That'll give you an idea of the frictive beauty in the way we used to get our food in cities. And this is what Creole Italian does so elegantly, and what we at NYC Foodways aim to do likewise. To chronicle ways of life, some extinct, some moribund, some thriving, all bound by the common threads of food and culture. Speaking of thriving, there could be no discussion of Creole Italian, ironic or otherwise, without a section on the famous muffalata sandwich, specifically the one from Central Grocery on Lower Decatur Street in the French Quarter. This is a sandwich for the ages, a sandwich eternal, a sandwich so unique and so good that, With apologies to Voltaire, if it didn't exist, we would have to invent it. The muffalata from Central Grocery is worth making a trip for, is worth waiting in line for, and is worth the price, which, when you consider how freaking enormous the thing is actually a great deal. Most devotees of New Orleans cuisine, Nystrom writes, recognize muffalata as the sandwich found on numerous city menus and identified around the world with the Central Grocery. But the name actually comes from the bread itself, a browned, airy, Sicilian-style loaf about 10 inches across and topped with sesame seeds. And check this one out. Like macaroni, the muffalata loaf eventually found its way into the diet of a broader spectrum of New Orleanians, but the bread took longer and did so only as the vehicle for layers of capicola and provolone and a generous heaping of olive salad. The story of its baking is akin to the narrative of Sicilian New Orleans writ large, a multi-generational endeavor whose objective lies at the intersection of commercial enterprise and cultural expression. Right. Doesn't this guy just get it? Again, this is what NYC Foodways is all about. Food is the physical representation of the metaphysical intersection of the sacred and the profane, the self and the universe, commercial enterprise and cultural expression. Hell yeah. New Orleans is so unique among American cities, and there is so much that is so particular about the place that the fact that this book can talk about the shopping habits of women from a single neighborhood and have readers nodding their heads knowingly speaks to how many only in New Orleans things really are only in New Orleans. This is a city, Nystrom writes, that even today manages to insulate itself from those normalizing and homogenizing paradigms that govern the rest of America, hewing steadfastly to anachronism either out of an appreciation for tradition or out of sheer stubbornness. It is embedded in 1,000 homey quirks seldom seen elsewhere that betray a sometimes unhealthy addiction to the good life, casually and silently expressing a disregard for how things are done in Chicago or Atlanta, or New York for that matter. I really could keep going here. I was so taken by this book that after finishing it, I reached out to Dr. Nystrom directly and was pleased to get a response in short order. With any luck, there will be an NYC Foodways follow-up conversation with the author to discuss aspects of Creole Italian in greater detail. Nystrom, like many of us who truly appreciate New Orleans, has a strong preservationist bent. He loves the old buildings, the old traditions, the old foodways, and the old-timers of the city. In Creole Italian, he has done a commendable job setting up and preserving his own historical district, a historical district of memory, where the rich food and cultural legacy of the tens of thousands of Sicilian immigrants to New Orleans will be preserved in perpetuity for all to enjoy. Much love, Professor Nystrom. It's heartening to know we don't fight this battle alone. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next week for another episode of NYC Foodways. Peace.